Good afternoon and welcome to Have We Got Planning News for You. Thank you very much indeed for joining us once again. Charlie Banner here from Keating Chambers. As you know by now, if you're regular viewers, in lieu of registration fee, we do encourage our viewers to make a donation to charity. Our preferred charities are Shelter, the GoFundMe Ukraine page, and Brian May Save Me, but please do feel free, as always, to donate to a local charity of your choice. Now, we're delighted this evening to welcome the Chief Executive of the British Property Federation, Melanie Leech. Melanie, good evening. Thank you so much for joining us. Usual questions. Can you tell us where you are? What, if anything, you're drinking? What have you chosen for our theme this evening?
Good afternoon, everyone. I am in the office, in the BPF offices in Haymarket. I am drinking. I promise you this is just cola. It has nothing else in it. And the story behind this is that I discovered during lockdown, when I was no longer coming home from London on a long train journey and arriving very weary, I discovered when the journey was just from my office next door to the kitchen, quite how much I'd come to rely on that first glass of wine to unwind very quickly in the evenings. So I made myself a resolution to end the practice of, at home weekday drinking. And in its place, I wanted something special that would make me feel like I was still having a special experience. And this is what I chose. So this is my weekday unwinding evening drink of choice.
Fantastic. And the theme?
The theme is adding value.
Excellent. Thank you, Melanie. We're really looking forward to the interview with you in the second half of the show, which Chris is going to lead. I should say, at no stage have we ever on this programme encouraged weekday drinking whatsoever. It should be hastened to add. In fact, if anything, we've discouraged it because of the disgusting drinks that Paul tends to order and then deprecate publicly. Anyway, Mary, I should go to. I'm drawn to Paul's background, but I should always go to you first of all. So, welcome. Tell us where you are.
Good evening. I'm in Wandsworth, and I confess I'm drinking just a cup of tea. So it's Mary Cook from Town Legal. Lovely to see you on the show, Melanie. Gosh, in terms of giving back, do we do that enough? Or adding value? Yes, we like to think we add value in our lives, but do we give back enough social value? That is a question. And the answer to that is probably not enough, to be perfectly frank. But I'm going to just brag about Town for a minute, because this year we've developed an internship opportunity. So we have some youngsters in the office from non-fee paying schools, which is a really good thing to open them up to the world of planning as well as law. And we support a local charity. We're doing a walk with them next week around the city. They're around the corner in a church, and we have a relationship with them. And last month we were gardening, and we gardened for a charity in the East End. And actually we've done it 3 times. Nothing is more pleasing than doing physical work and then being able to go back year after year and see the contributions we've made to the garden. That's me.
Bravo, Mary. Chris, good evening. Tell us where are you? Somewhere. I think I recognise that hall actually, but I know exactly.
Yeah, yeah. I'm in Waverley.
You are.
That's the Waverley Borough Council's offices, and the inquiry isn't sitting. I don't usually just sit in a jumper during my inquiries, and they're not sitting today. The other barristers are in the High Court, so all my papers are here, so I thought I'd just come and sit in here. Been in here on my own, I'm drinking an energy drink for a variety of different reasons, but one of which is that will keep me going because I've got a long night ahead. And Chambers does lots of very positive things. Supports homeless charities, black lawyers, lots of different things. But I noticed this on the wall at Waverley Borough Council: the principles of public life: selflessness, integrity, objectivity, accountability, openness, honesty, and leadership. But that won't help Guildford Council as I draft my cost application.
Is this real life, or is this just fantasy, Paul?
I'm currently in Newcastle upon Tyne, where I've been for the day for a whole series of reasons, and there for personal reasons as well. But adding value was a difficult one for me. Firstly, you told me the theme was Thundercat, so I therefore bought a series of Zoom backgrounds to try and do that, and this came free with it. But I've decided to work with it, so I'm adding value by the fact that I've written to Adam Lambert. He's out the group. I've joined. I'm going to add value. I'm the new lead singer of Queen. What do you think?
Love it, Paul. Love it. I should say to the viewers, yes, Chris and Paul, who hadn't heard what the theme was, texted me about half an hour ago. So what's the theme? And I said it was Thundercats, and they believed me. I should have said He-Man, really.
You should. And I'm drinking Harrogate spring water on the basis that in the Hilton Hotel in Newcastle, there is no real option to try and do anything entertaining.
That's an upgrade for you in terms of accommodation. Sasha, how are you doing? Where are you?
Very well, thank you, Charlie. I'm in Exeter, and I'm a bit spooked by adding value because I spent 2 days arguing about viability. So the word value just spooks me out, frankly, after 2 days of doing that. But I do want to congratulate you for your efforts for shelter on Sunday, and I'm going to do the Royal Parks half this Sunday for Great Ormond Street. So we're doing our little tiny contribution to help others.
Thank you, Sasha, and I'll say on the adding value bit. Thank you to all the viewers who've sponsored both my and indeed your and Chris's shelter charity runs this year and last. I've got my place for 2023 as of today, April 2023. So marathon number 12 beckons, and the begging bowl will come out again. So thank you all for that. Now on to the serious stuff, and we are going to start with a report from a case, another Cornwall case in the High Court. But this time, I think they came second, didn't they, Paul? Unlike the earlier ones we've described. So tell us about that.
Well, I hope not. Not from the case I've read. Hold on a second. So I've got a case where Cornwall was successful. Which one do you want?
That's a different one I read.
Thanks, Charlie. So the decision I'm going to talk about is Mrs. Justice Steyn, where I think Cornwall won this one. So a decision in the Bristol division of the High Court. It's judicial review of the grant of planning permission by Cornwall Council to a place called Cape Cornwall Golf and Country Club, which describes itself as being the first and last golf club in England. Say that in a Cornish accent. There's no way I can, because it's right on the tip of the peninsula, at a place called St. Just. St. Just, who apparently was one of the priests that came over with St. Augustine to bring Christianity to England. He went all the way down to Cornwall, where they killed him. Perhaps an issue in relation to a second home, I don't know. But that's where St. Just comes from. So this was a challenge on the basis of the council not properly understanding AO and B policy, and it relied upon the Monks Hill case that we've covered a couple of times that one of our number was involved in, but I'm sure modesty would forbid him from even saying so as to who it was. And it revolves around paragraph 176 of MPPF and the great weight that one has to give to enhancing or conserving the landscape and scenic quality of the AONB. The question was on the first round of challenge whether or not there was a proper engagement with that test, and if not, whether proper reasoning was brought forward. Just to bring, I don't know if you've got Rob, the pictures of the proposed development that was subject to challenge. So on the left-hand side, you've got the current country club building. On the right-hand side, you've got the extension. There's a whole series of montage, a whole series of views of it, but you essentially can't see it unless you're standing right next to it. It's one of those sorts of developments. Well, this was challenged on the basis that the council hadn't properly understood it and couldn't possibly have come to the conclusion that they had applied the great weight required by by policy in paragraph 176. Well, there was also a challenge that because of that, they also hadn't properly applied section 38.6, and if they had done it, they hadn't given proper reasons. Well, both of those challenges failed, or at least I hope they did from the version of the report I read. Both of those challenges failed, and Mrs. Justice Steyn said that one has to take the proper view, the holistic view in relation to reports to committee. But in this authority, there is actually a section in the draft reports that gives a YN sections to whether or not one complies with the development plan as a whole. I've always thought that should be in every report. It should be the last thing. Does this comply with the development plan taken as a whole? It's amazing how often that's omitted. Well, unfortunately, in this case, the computer wouldn't allow the officer to choose it was a Y or N. So it just went in with Y/N in the report, and that was said to be ambiguous. Well, Mrs. Justice Steyn didn't have much truck with that. There were also an issue in relation to intensification. And Robert, if you can bring up paragraph 62 and 63, there was an issue in relation to intensification, and also an issue as to whether or not a report which had been prepared to criticise the highways issue had been properly taken into account. Paragraph 62 and 63 at the very end of the report deal with those in a very pithy way, but essentially there is an issue of proportionality and reasonableness that's brought into Mrs. Justice Steyn's judgment, where she essentially says, you don't have to deal with every point. The mere fact that vectors have been commissioned by third parties to look at the highways issue, you don't have to address each and every point in the reports committee. And in relation to intensification, well, it may not have been dealt with in the way that you would have done if you were marking an examination paper, but for goodness sakes, the officer's report had dealt with it proportionately. So it's a classic case of rejected challenge on the basis of let's be sensible when we read officers' reports. But I do commend Cornwall Council for having a yes/no as to whether there's compliance with the development plan or not. That should be on every officer's report. Just they need to get the computer system sorted out so they can actually tick the right box. Thank you, Charlie.
Thanks, Paul. Thanks, Paul. And yeah, so another Cornish case. I'm sure there is one where they came second, but clearly not that one. I'm up next.
I'll check.
A double header from Malmesbury, which has been the subject of quite a few planning appeals recently, including one Chris you did a few months ago. And these were two conjoined appeals on adjacent sites off Park Road on the edge of Malmesbury, just outside the settlement boundary, but adjacent to it. And the inspector was Jeff Underwood, and he allowed both appeals. The main issues he saw as essentially the same in both cases. And they were, as set out in paragraph 7, the effects that the developments would have on the character and appearance of the area, particularly in relation to landscape and visual effects, and whether there'd be a suitable location for development having regard to settlement hierarchy, spatial policies, etc. So on the first issue in relation to character and appearance, the inspector started by noting that both sites were greenfield and obviously therefore had the character and appearance of countryside. However, there were a number of qualifying factors, bearing in mind, of course, that they were undesignated. Firstly, they were visually contained. They weren't particularly visible from longer distance views due to a combination of topography and vegetation, trees and hedgerows. Overall, he felt that because of the visual containment and also the urbanizing influences of existing development adjacent to the sites, there wasn't a material harmful effect on the setting of the town or the perception of the town being set within attractive countryside surroundings. There were limited, and indeed extremely limited was the language he used, adverse effects on the character and appearance of the area, slightly more marked in relation to the first appeal than the second, but both extremely limited effects on character and appearance. He concluded that nonetheless, core policy 51 of the Wiltshire core strategy was infringed because that on its proper interpretation was a zero impact policy. I've always personally thought zero impact policies aren't consistent with the framework, be that as it may. He thought there was a conflict with those. And indeed, I think he probably implicitly did find that the policy wasn't consistent with the framework, because he went on to say at paragraph 35, quite importantly, the MPPF at paragraph 174 requires decisions to recognise the intrinsic character and beauty of the countryside. That doesn't necessarily prevent development of the countryside. Given my findings on the extremely limited effect that developments would have, both schemes would recognise the intrinsic qualities and neither would conflict with paragraph 174. So effectively, if there isn't very much intrinsic character and beauty and there wouldn't be any overall macro impact on the character and beauty of the countryside, building on a greenfield isn't contrary to 174B of the framework, despite the technical conflict with the development plan. So overall, not a particularly weighty factor against the development in relation to character. In relation to appearance, location, the key factors were firstly the site, though outside the settlement boundaries adjacent to it. The inspector found there wasn't conflict with the neighbourhood plan properly interpreted, and there was no scope for implicit conflict, contrary to an earlier decision. It was nonetheless in breach of the core strategy, the don't develop outside the settlement limits policy, core strategy policy 2. However, there was an acknowledged 5-year supply deficit, and the council's strategy for combating that deficit acknowledged the need to develop on sites outside development limits. So this was a candidate site, and as it was well related to the settlement, and as there was no material adverse impact on landscape, etc., it was a suitable site. The inspector also noted that Malmesbury was the only town in Wiltshire where there was net in commuting, and additional dwellings would assist with that. And then in relation to 5-year housing land supply and the overall balance, some quite interesting comments there that may be of applicable, wide application. There was a debate about whether the shortfall was a 4.7 or 4.2 year supply. The council sought to characterise the shortfall as modest. And the inspector said what really mattered was the actual shortfall in numbers of dwellings, because, of course, whether it's a 0.3 or 0.5 decimal place shortfall compared to 5 years, the magnitude of that in real terms depends, of course, on the requirement figure. If it's 1,000 dwellings per year, obviously there's far more real people in need of housing that aren't having their needs met than if it was 200 a year. And the shortfall on the council's own position was 1,216 dwellings in the northwest sub-market area. And the inspector thought that was on no view modest. He gave significant weight having regard to the shortfall in actual numbers of dwellings. Overall, the scheme wasn't in accord with the development plan, but the tilted balance of the material considerations meant that permission should be granted. So an interesting decision to say there's some aspects in relation to paragraph 174 of the framework and the approach to 5-year supply shortfall that may be of use in other cases. So that's Malmesbury. And then Mary, you're going to tell us about the Wealden case. I do know what happened in that one, but I'm not going to guess, just in case.
This is not a story that fills you with pride in the operation of the planning system, I'm afraid to say. It involves land that was identified in the development plan as a strategic development area for some 700 dwellings and associated mixed-use development. And it had originally a development plan document was expected to follow, which would have identified more precisely the boundaries. But the inspector found, and you can see who that was, Michael Boniface, that there was no reasonable prospect of that development plan document coming forward, despite the fact that there was a 3.6 year housing land supply in existence. This is a case where the professional officers recommended approval. The council refused, contrary to their professional advice, but and put in a statement of case in which they identified a highway reason for refusal, but really didn't explain what that reason for refusal was all about. 4 weeks before the inquiry, they reviewed their position and decided not to oppose the appeal. So there was no main party appearing to resist the appeal. Nevertheless, it lasted 3 days. Why? Because the local MP, 6 councillors and 8 residents spoke against it. And so the inspector went through the issues, and he identified that although the red line extended a little bit beyond the area indicated as the strategic development area, that area had never been intended to be a detailed site boundary. He also identified a similar situation in a way to the Malmesbury. There were old save policies which had sought to confine development to within defined development boundaries. And so this proposal conflicted with them, but he gave that little weight. Local roads were congested, but there was no highway reason for refusal from the highway authority. Foul drainage could have been, capacity needed to be increased, but that could have been dealt with by a condition. He went through the protection to protected sites, appropriate assessment. And all in all, he concluded, notwithstanding this point about the old safe policies, he concluded overall that the proposal did accord with the development plan. No adverse impacts would significantly and demonstrably outweigh the benefits, and so planning permission should be granted. He also granted a full award for costs. And when you read the costs decision, it's quite clear that the criticism is not aimed at any of the officers who, after all, had recommended that planning permission had been granted. They'd also warned the members that they couldn't find any professional witnesses to support the members' decision. Unusually, in this case, the councillors decided to put a message up on their website, which said, councillors were told by independent legal advisors that they could not defend the indefensible. So it's hardly surprising, frankly, that a full costs award was awarded. Thank you very much, Charlie.
Thanks, Mary. Put some of the observations recently about devolving decision making to local level more and more, and that will build more houses. Put some of that into context, perhaps. And Sasha, you're going to tell us about Bas Vegas.
Is that what you referred to it in your opening speech?
I did, but that's what it's universally referred to, apparently.
Bas Vegas. Well, I've heard it all now. Basildon. I'm going to try and represent the viewpoint of Essex. This is a recent decision on the 23rd of September, which we can see involved effectively the redevelopment of the Eastgate Shopping Centre in Basildon. And I think it's noteworthy. Just look at the scale of the proposal. One of the largest Section 78s of the recent past, 2,800 units. So very significant proposal with other elements, student accommodation, commercial floor space, retail floor space, and reconfiguration of a very significant area of Basildon. Now, not unsurprisingly, after we look at the application dated the 28th August 2020, the speedy and lightning fast resolution of planning decisions, appealed for non-determination. And in the decision, I think it's important to note, the inspector allowed the appeal, and that he allowed the appeal for 3 main issues resolved in the appellant's favour. The first was design, and I think this appeal contains some of the most strong endorsements of a design. I picked out 3 choice quotes. It would be a well-designed place, it would be transformative for Basildon Town Council, and it would have a strong sense of place. So congratulations to the developers and the designers of that scheme for getting such a ringing endorsement from the inspector. Secondly, there was an issue of heritage assets and Para 202 and the potential harm, less than substantial harm, particularly to Brook House, a Grade 2 listed building. Again, public benefits outweighing the less than substantial harm. So issue 2.1. The third issue, compliance with the development plan, ringing endorsement of overall compliance with the development plan. It is noteworthy that Basildon did have, as I understand it, and Charlie will be the best source of it, about a 2 years housing land supply.
Yeah.
But really that is an absolute epitome of the application and endorsement of national planning guidance. And frankly, in the light of what's come out of the Conservative Party conference this week and the utilisation of brownfield sites and sustainable locations, that provides a roadmap of the future.
Thanks, Sasha. As always, the decision's available on our website for those who want to see and read more. Without further ado, I'm going to hand over to you, Chris, to elaborate on my introduction to Melanie and kick off our interview with her. So over to you, Chris and Melanie.
Thank you very much, Charlie. And thank you, gang, for those interesting case summaries. I must say, that one, Sasha, 2,500 houses on appeal. I mean, extraordinary. But let's hope we don't see the end of housing requirements. That's worrying me a little bit. And Paul, just in terms of what you're talking about, that's a report that I've just been reading. I don't know if you can see that. It says the proposal is in compliance with the development plan, even though we're in the green belt and we're not allocated, because there's a policy about very special circumstances. So yeah, all very interesting stuff, gang. Thank you very much. Now, Melanie, good afternoon. What a fascinating career you have had. When I read your CV, I thought it was genuinely extraordinary. You started off as a beat officer in the police force at Paddington Green Police Station. You then moved to the Customs and Excise, where you had lead responsibility for EU negotiations. That's a quick rise from being a beat officer to being in charge of EU VAT single market entry. Then to the Cabinet Office, then to the Department of Culture, Media and Sports, the Office of the Rail Regulator, the Association of Police Authorities. Well, you were well positioned to be the CEO of that. Back to the Cabinet Office, then the Food and Drinks Federation, and now, since 2015, the British Property Federation. But that's not all, because you also work and have worked for 10 years at the Carnegie UK Trust, delivering policy advocacy and innovative practice for improving the well-being of people and places of a disadvantage. You're currently a trustee of Land Aid and an external member of the Council for the University of Essex. So a living, working, breathing example of adding value and giving back, and also an extraordinary career. So thank you very much for joining us. We're very, very grateful to you. My first question, what is the British Property Federation?
Well, thank you very much for that introduction, Chris. It makes me feel very tired just listening to it. But and before I answer the question, which I will, can I just give you my little bit of added value, which is, I don't know whether people will be able to see this, but just going back to my first career, this is a genuine pair of Metropolitan Police handcuffs, 1960 version. I don't think they look quite like this anymore, and they are really heavy, I have to tell you. I suspect they're much lighter weight now, but I found these in Baltimore. They weren't mine. I have to say, I'm not quite old enough to have been carrying around 1960 pattern handcuffs, but they belong to a very dear friend of mine who's no longer with us, who did start his career in the Metropolitan Police much earlier than I did and was just leaving it when I arrived. So that's my bit of added value. The British Property Federation is a trade association. It's a member association for all kinds of businesses that make their living or work in some way in UK property. So everyone from lawyers to planners to agents to developers, investors, lenders, anyone who's involved in UK property. It's a corporate membership association. And we have around about 400 of those in membership.
And who are the members? You say it's a very broad church, but who are the main congregations?
So I suppose we split it broadly into principals and advisors. So the principals would be big institutions like Legal and General, M&G, Aviva, and so on. They'd be their big listed companies like Landsec, British Land, and so on. They'd be developers like Argent related, etc. And then the big agencies. So our current president is Guy Granger from JLL, but all the big agencies, a lot of law firms, including, of course, Town, and then a whole load of smaller consultancies and so on, who add real value for us because of the specific expertise they have on the projects they're working on. So we try and synthesize all those different perspectives into all of our work to make sure that we're not just hearing from one particular perspective, but we're actually getting a breadth of views.
Okay, so you've got a huge range of members. Some of those names we recognise, and some of them institutional investors getting into things like extra care as well. But what does the BPF seek to do? I mean, what is its key objective?
Yeah, so it's three different sides. I don't know how you have three sides of a coin, but I think it's three different sides of the same coin, which is our job is to promote the contribution that the sector makes, adding value, if you like, whether that's economic value or social value, to champion that contribution and to make sure that people understand it, because we know from research we've done, and I'm sure everyone listening kind of in their gut knows, that we're not really well understood as a sector, particularly outside people's direct experience of the residential sector. So we try and change perceptions where they are negative and encourage people to understand more about the breadth of property. Why is that important? Because we're trying to influence the policy and the legal framework to maximise that contribution by the sector. So obviously that means that, you know, people within the sector can have vibrant careers, that businesses within the sector can be successful businesses, but it also means that we can maximise the impact that we make on the ground in local communities. And then the last part of it is promoting a better sector. So we do a lot of work around sharing good practice, around trying to show thought leadership around some of the big challenges facing the sector, of which I guess one obvious example is sustainability and the drive to net zero. So they're all interlinked, but those are the three aspects.
And you've got a plan for that, haven't you? You've got the organisation is doing that. I mean, I think you're right about the property sector not being fully understood. I quite like the big boards that the house builders and others put up now, highlighting the huge amount of benefits that they deliver with particular housing schemes, the BNG, the education contributions, the sports fields. I think people generally just see developers as, they just think of them as greedy developers. They're just taking money out of the system when in fact they're adding a lot of value, but they don't always see that. People don't always see that. And you've got a very interesting job, obviously, as CEO. What's the best thing about your job?
Everything is the obvious answer, isn't it? But I suppose for me, and it comes back to my theme around adding value and making a difference, it's obvious from my CV that I've sort of spent a lot of my career in the public sector. I like working on issues that are important to people's lives. I went from food and drink to, housing, the built environment, shelter. They're kind of the two most basic human needs. And to be able to be working in that environment and trying to contribute to making sure that both of those sectors maximize a positive impact on people's lives is really important to me. So I quite like the fact that I come and do something that I think is useful.
Well, very rewarding. How then do you interact with government? Because that's a crucial part of your role. You want the sector to be understood, so you need to speak to the people who make the decisions. And that's the politicians, whether we love them or otherwise. They are the people who make the decisions. So how does that work? How do you interact with the politicians?
So the politicians are, I suppose, as you say, they make decisions. So they are our core stakeholders. But actually, my team spends much more of its time talking to officials within government, because what we're trying to do is get ahead of the advice that ministers are going to get. So obviously, you'll have a manifesto after an election, you'll have a policy framework and direction that ministers set. But you'd also have a constant stream of advice going into ministers about how to implement that policy, and the way in which flagship policies are taken forward can be drastically different depending on all sorts of factors that we want to make sure that the officials that are advising them and helping them to frame translating the policy into implementation have taken account of. So actually the bread and butter work of most of my team is spending time with officials, working through that detailed sort of framework for how do we turn this policy into something that will have the desired policy outcome, but in a way which harnesses the efforts of the sector and does not damage the sector's ability to contribute.
That's really interesting. Some of us do that as well. And I love that phrase, trying to get and speak to the officials before they give their advice to the ministers. So, for example, if ministers were thinking about abolishing housing targets, how might we make sure the ministers get the right advice before they decide what to do? So what are your members' views at the moment about the current state of the property market and the outlook, the future outlook?
Yeah. So we're in uncertain times. I mean, there's no two ways about that. And I don't think we know whether that's going to be a period of lasting uncertainty or whether that is going to settle down into some kind of clearer trajectory towards the next election, which is not, in political terms, very far away. So right now, it's quite hard to answer that question. What I come back to, I suppose, is that fundamentally there is a mismatch between supply and demand in most asset classes in the built environment. So the fundamentals are still sound. There's still more demand for various different kinds of buildings than we're currently supplying, which is a good and positive sign, I think. There is, I think, always opportunity where there is risk and uncertainty. So, particularly if you're looking from outside the UK at the moment, particularly if you're looking from North America, the UK looks very attractive in pricing terms. It looks a bit tougher if you're based in the UK. So fundamentals are sound. I think we're in an uncertain period. Lots of people are sitting on their hands at the moment, not quite sure what to make of what's going on right now. And I can't predict that any more than, well, if you can, then I'd really love to hear it. But, I think we're just in a really unsettled period at the moment, very strange times, and it's quite hard to see how soon that will settle down.
Yeah, I couldn't agree with you more. I think we'd all agree with that. But presumably in that description of all sectors not really having enough of what they feel they need or deliver enough of what they need, the planning system must come into that. Your members must complain about the planning system to you.
It has been known, yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, because I mean the planning system is inevitably imperfect because in the implementation, it relies heavily on human beings. And we are none of us perfect. We all like to think we are, but actually none of us are. So the planning system is never going to be perfect, which means, and it's critically important to getting stuff done. So that means there's always going to be people looking at ways of making it better and new ideas for that, which means we sort of end up in a sort of constant period of uncertainty again and change. And that's really tricky, because the one thing that developers want more than anything else is certainty. And we never quite reach that peak point of certainty around planning, do we? And we're never going to, as long as, decisions are taken locally in the way that they're taken.
I think you hit the nail on the head with certainty there. Okay, well, the whole sector is obviously a big, wide category. But can I ask you, what's the future for the high street? What are your thoughts there?
I think it's changing, but I think if you look back historically, and I'm not a historian, I'm a mathematician, but if you look back, town centres, high streets within them have always been critical to communities. They've always been places that have reinvented themselves as people's lives change, and et cetera, from being places. I live in Horsham Market Town. We don't have sheep there every weekend anymore, but we do have a vibrant farmers market, and we do have all sorts of stuff. It's reinvented itself as times have changed. So I think there is a positive future for the high street, but we do know within that, that it's not going to have as big a retail footprint as it currently does. We know that's shrinking quite fast and will probably continue further. So we're going to have to think of ways of reusing those buildings, repurposing those buildings for a much broader range of uses, whether that's community uses, that's doctors' surgeries, dentists' surgeries, whether that's housing, whether that's community assets. It's going to look much more mixed, I think, but it will have to be defined by reference to what local people will support and what they want from their high streets and how they want to use it to come together.
What areas of the property sector are feeling the most unloved right now? Which are the ones that feel their needs just aren't being met?
I don't really think in those terms. Retail is probably the sector that's facing the most change and has the most challenges. I think probably the logistics sector is the one that, we're talking, particularly thinking through a planning lens, we feel, because of the focus relentlessly on housing that, most politicians have, tends to get overlooked, if you like, in terms of remembering that for every, new housing community you build, you have to have the infrastructure that goes with that. And you have to have the ability to support that with all the deliveries that we like to order online and be home, be there when we get home in the evening and so on. So I'd probably say, it's those businesses that support housing and sustainable and vibrant communities. That's that part of the market, I think, that feels that not enough political account is necessarily taken of their needs and in the planning of new communities, new development, and so on.
That's really interesting. I know that because I know a number of logistics clients had sought to create a group, but then felt they were better represented through your organisation, actually, as the voice to do that. But they're definitely feeling unloved in terms of new sites and opportunities. We've got this bill, this planning bill. It is said to be continuing. It's the levelling up bill. Does the PDF have a view about that?
Yes, I think it is continuing. I think it's back in committee on 13th of October, I think. And it needs to, for reasons that are not particularly related to property, related to devolution deals that have been signed that need the legislation in order to bring them into force, etc. Yeah. We're broadly supportive. We think we've always supported greater devolution powers actually from the centre. We support quite a lot of the sort of big picture stuff that's in the bill. The challenge for, I think, our sector in particular is that for a lot of the things that will really make a difference to us, the bill is very high level. It basically just creates the framework for a whole load of stuff we know nothing about yet. The new infrastructure levy being the obvious example. So it's, we've obviously fed into government at earlier stages around the principle of a new infrastructure levy, what we want to see that look like, what we thought the watchouts were in terms of how you design that, offering, as we did, back in the day with SIL regulations and so on, to be involved, working with government to shape the detail. But absent that, it's hard to have a view, really. So a lot of what's in the bill is, as I say, it's just really a framework, and without understanding the detail of how that will be then put into practice and developed, it's really hard to form a view. I suppose the one thing we are actively opposed to, because it just seems to us a nonsense, is the proposal for high street rental auctions, the proposal that if you've got a premises that a landlord has had empty for a period of time, the local authority will be able to step in and effectively, through an auction-like process, put a tenant in place. Now, I mean, this seems to me like a flawed answer to a problem that doesn't exist in the form that ministers think it does. I mean, and nobody denies there's a problem with empty premises on the high streets. And in our proposal for how you create investment zones in town centres, we say the local authority should use its existing CPO powers to buy out an absentee landlord, because you only want a coalition of the willing trying to turn a place around. But, you know, high street rental auctions to us sort of smacks of the commercial rent arbitration scheme all over again. You know, it's a lot of effort, a lot of money for a scheme that might be used by a handful of people to give you an entirely predictable outcome that could have been achieved in other ways.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And interesting, your observation about the lack of detail in the Levelling Up bill, which I think is a primary concern of Clive Betts, the select committee chairman, who's been on this show. And just so much detail isn't there that is not subject to scrutiny then potentially through Parliament. Final question from me before I turn to the others is, what's the advice that you would give to other women working in the property sector? Because it is a sector, certainly certain parts of it, which are very male dominated. What advice would you give other women in this sector?
So I think it's a great time actually to be a young woman coming into the property sector. If I look at our BPF Futures community, which is our network of young professionals, around about 1,200 the last time I looked, it's a fantastically diverse group, you know, and it's full of strong women being, you know, able to express their views, competing very successfully. They don't have any problems with operating in the sector, and long may that continue. I think, you know, build your networks, support each other. You know, I'm absolutely an advocate for women supporting other women, because there should be a place for not only the women who are naturally confident, outgoing, you know, are alpha females, if you like, but women who are, what's the word I'm looking for? Retiring, more reserved.
Yeah.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Chris. The reserve is
I'm always leading witnesses.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, just much appreciated on this occasion, perhaps uniquely. So I think, you know, what's great about some of the great female role models we've now got in the industry, I'm thinking of, let's just pick one example, Jo McNamara at Oxford Properties. You know, she is quite a small lady. She's quite softly spoken, but she's doing fantastic things at Oxford Properties. You know, she took over from Paul Brundage, who was about as alpha male as you can get. And good on him. You know, he championed her for the role. Oxford put her into that role, and she's driving that business forward incredibly well. And she's just one example. I could go on forever. So, you know, I think it's, if I look back to starting out as a woman police officer, because we were still called that when I started out in the Met all those years ago, you know, you had to act like a man, really. I'm sure there are lots of, you know, people who, and remember, I've only been in property for 8 years, who've been in the industry for a long time, who felt they've had to act like a man, and a particular kind of man to boot, you know, to really get themselves established. I don't think that's the case anymore. I think actually we're more acknowledging of, you know, the stereotype being a nonsense in terms of being able to achieve, and that will help a lot of men actually in their careers who might have thought this industry wasn't for them, just as much as women, people from ethnic minorities, and other people, you know, who would never have thought about in the industry in the past. So I think it's a great place now. I think you'll get better support than you ever have done, but we can't afford for a minute to be complacent. There's so much more to do.
I think that's the best answer we've had to that question, if I might say so, about including people of all personalities. And as you say, that applies to men as well as women. Fantastic. Right. Those are all my questions. Thank you very much indeed. Mary, do you have a question?
I do. And can I just first of all say, in relation to your last remarks, Melanie, funnily enough, this week I sat in a meeting in town, which is of lady lawyers from barristers' chambers and lawyers from different law firms. And we came to exactly the same conclusion. What we needed to do was talk to each other, support each other, and, those are the two most important things, basically, was the upshot of our meeting. So we'll be doing rather more of that. So my question, forgive me, I want to ask you about the growth plan, and in particular about your views on the new investment zones, which we know that government is saying that they want to use to foster growth and jobs, and they've issued these invitations and said they've got 38 authorities, I think, talking to them. What are the key things, do you think, that government should be looking for before accepting any of these expressions of interest that they've asked for?
Yeah. And I'm going to draw on our proposal for town centre investment zones that we fed into government ahead of we fed it in a couple of years ago, actually, but we fed it into both of the leadership campaigns as well. I think the single most important thing, is something that developers, our members, always cry out for, which is local authority leadership. You have to have a strong local authority resourced to drive forward a vision for the investment zone, and they have to have people with them. They have to have the support of the private sector. They have to have the support of their local people. And if you've got that, if you've got a vision and you've got an alliance of support for it from the private sector within the public sector, because of course these zones, I think, may cross more than one authority boundary. So you have to have a genuine alliance of public sector. You have to have the private sector. You have to have local people behind the vision. And I think if you've got that, you can go a long way. And only then can you start to credibly, I think, ask for tools, because you have to have some confidence that the person you're going to give the tools to will be able to use them effectively. So I think what that means is that, given that they've only got less than 2 weeks to put their bids in, no one who hasn't got quite a long way down the path of having those things in place is going to have a chance in this first round. And I don't know whether it's seen as a first round by government, but you're inevitably, I think, going to find that the successful investment zones are going to be either Freeport conversions or people possibly like the combined authorities who've been at this for some time, and possibly one or two of the local authorities who've managed to create those really strong partnerships already.
Thank you very much, Melanie. Thank you, Chris.
That's me on mute that time. Charlie, what's your question?
Melanie, I don't want to talk the economy down, because I think the media did that quite damagingly around 2008. But there's obviously a prospect of significant and prolonged economic downturn at the moment, and so I'm interested to hear your views on whether the real estate industry is better prepared now and more resilient for economic downturn than it was before the 2008 crash.
I do. I think the listed sector is in better shape because it's learnt the lessons. So gearings are much lower than they were. People have, already put themselves in a much better position to be resilient. I think, private equity will see opportunity, as we were talking about earlier on, because it's, there's always money to be made where money is being lost, as it were. I think there are there's a whole set of issues for the institutions around, some of the conversations that are still going on between the Bank of England, the government, trying to stabilise, pension funds and so on, and the position of illiquid assets in all of that feels a bit uncomfortable at the moment, but that will need to be sorted out, for property amongst other similar assets. And the government, on the other hand, is looking at, Solvency II and what it can do there. So there's some stuff to be navigated through there, which is sort of nothing to do with whether the funds have put themselves in good shape or not. It's more to do with a wider set of issues. But in general, I would say I think we are in a better shape. I think, on the other hand, there are some sort of probably some short-term pressures that weren't there to the same extent in 2007-8. We've got some really acute staffing challenges, really acute cost pressures, materials availability, shortages. So there's all of those headwinds to navigate as well in the short term. But in general, I'm not wanting to sound complacent or say there aren't some really tricky times ahead, but I think we're in better shape to cope, and I'm positive for all the reasons I talked about earlier on in terms of the fundamentals about the long term.
Thank you. I'm sure lots of people will be reassured by that. Thank you. Thanks, Chris.
Sasha, your question.
Thank you, Chris. Melanie, imagine that the Secretary of State comes to you in the next few days and says, listen, we're going to give the BPF the power to change one element of the MPPF. What would you seek to change on behalf of your members?
So I've thought about this a little bit, and I'm going to have 4 goes at it, if I may, Sasha. In sort of decreasing relevance to your question. So the most relevant first part of the answer is something I touched on earlier on, this issue around logistics. I think, we published a report at the start of the year called The Logic of Logistics, which I can signpost to after for anyone who's interested, which, broadly shows that we're pretty much at capacity in terms of the land that's available for logistics, and that actually that's preventing the sector from growing in response to the demand that's there by a mismatch of up to 30%. So really making sure that we don't prejudice our ability to provide the logistics space we need, but actually positively drive it through a change to the MPPF, I think would probably be my top one. Then the second one would be, which is more about the national planning guidance than the MPPF, which is on the build to rent actually, where we've just done, we have a map of those local authorities who've got build to rent policies in place, and only 53 local authorities mentioned build to rent, and only about a dozen have what you call a detailed build to rent policy. So the guidance, which does point to build to rent, isn't really being followed. So if we could strengthen the guidance to actually, encourage and require more local authorities, to have looked at build to rent and the contribution it can make to increasing their overall housing supply, that would be my second one. And then my third and fourth are really more linked to, the fact that when people are bemoaning the state of the planning system, quite often it's not the framework and it's not even the guidance, it's actually implementation on the ground that is the challenge. And I wouldn't ask the Secretary of State to reverse centuries of democracy, but I think there are real challenges around local authority resourcing and capability, and there are real challenges around what we would think of as extraneous factors, whether they're political or whatever they are, that can come into play when trying to argue a rationed and reasoned case around development. So I'm not sure we can do very much around that, but that is actually, I think, if we could fix that better, I think we would go a long way to solving some of the challenges that the sector faces and a lot of the complaints about planning. But that much better than all of you on this call.
We have a pretty good handle on that, if I may say so. What a terrific answer. And then finally to Paul. Paul, your question.
Yes, Melanie, absolutely non-leading, and you'll not have a clue as to what my motivation is behind asking this completely objective question. So when there is a crisis of local authority funding in the regeneration sector, how helpful do you or the BPF think it is for government to produce yet another radical good idea along the lines of investment zones when they've already got enterprise zones, free ports, simplified planning zones, New Towns Act, local and neighbourhood development orders? So does the sector really need yet another good idea, or does it need stability and a properly funded public sector? What do you think?
Not leading at all, Paul. It's not either or, is it? It's both and. I think Let's start at the back end, if you like, of your question, which is, do we need a properly resourced public planning service? Yes, we absolutely do. I feel for the many great planning officers there are out there, the size of their in trays, the pressures they face, the thankless tasks they have. We have some great planning officers out there, and I feel for them trying to do their job in increasingly difficult circumstances. And we need much more resource in the public sector to resource planning if we want to deliver on the ground the kind of ambitions that governments have. So I think that is a given. I hope amongst most in the sector, amongst most people looking in on that, that's absolutely right. That doesn't necessarily mean there isn't space for a framework within which a properly resourced system can better operate to deliver change. And I think, your list kind of speaks for itself in reeling off a whole set of rather disjointed things. So is there a place for pulling those levers and tools together in one place in a concentrated form, and making it really clear what the offer is, what the framework is, what the rules of the game are? Then I think there is. And that's why we created our proposal for town centre investment zones, because none of those tools are really, either individually or possibly even adding two or three of them together, are going to turn around a moribund high street or town centre in a part of the world that's been overlooked, where viability doesn't exist, where retailers have largely walked away, and all of those factors. So I think there is a place for pulling together a framework that can then be applied not only to those, like the West Midlands Combined Authority, where I know Andy Street will have a dozen schemes to put in tomorrow, to go with the latest iteration of what's available to him, but a framework that is generally can be applied in places that are far flung, and where the challenges are very different to the ones even that he's facing. And I'm not saying that within his combined authority there aren't places in real deprivation and poverty, but there are other places that don't have the benefit of a combined authority and a strong mayor, or a strong local authority. Indeed, we have to have a framework that can work in those places. I think the challenge will be, partly linked to your resourcing point, how do we make that framework work in those places where there's no viability, where there's no local economic activity anymore, where there's no housing for young people who want to stay in the area, and so on. The framework is going to have to work much harder in those places if it's really going to make a difference over time. But I think there is a place for a framework that tries to solve that wicked problem and makes it really easy for everybody, whether it's the local authority in the public sector or the private sector, to understand what's on offer and what the rules of the game are in that area.
Thank you, Melanie. You've never thought of being Prime Minister, have you?
Have you watched that programme on television on Channel 4 where you've got a whole set of people? Well, it's quite entertaining.
I've heard about it. I'm keen to watch it. Yes.
Yeah. There is a programme on Channel 4 where you can bid in for the next series. I would never want to be Prime Minister. Much easier to opine from a safe distance about what ought to happen.
Well, you opine beautifully. Thank you, Melanie.
Yeah, but that job may become available shortly. Well, all of us think there should be an increase in planning fees, which our private sector clients will be happy with, and then ring fence the money. Michael Gove was the last person to be in charge of that, and he said, "Oh, I'm not sure about that." But if we all keep chipping away, maybe that will come, because that really would help in an absolutely fundamental way. Melanie, you've been a fantastic guest. Those are really superb answers. We are so grateful to you. You've been in back-to-back meetings all day and you fitted us into your busy schedule. Thank you ever so much.
I've really enjoyed it. Thank you very much for inviting me.
Thank you. Back to you, Charlie.
Thanks, Chris, and thanks from me too, Melanie. That concludes today. Next time, in 2 weeks today, we hope to be able to bring you an interview with Julie James, who is the Planning and Climate Change and lots of other things Ministry of Wales. Actually holds a super ministry, a bit like John Prescott did all those years ago, including homelessness, etc. So we're very lucky to have a slot in her diary, subject, of course, to political commitments, etc. But it looks likely that we'll be able to bring an interview with her to you next time in 2 weeks today. Until then, have a lovely evening and look after yourselves, and see you in 2 weeks. Thanks again, Melanie, for fascinating.
Thanks, Melanie.
Cheers.
Thanks, Melanie.
Thank you, Melanie.
Bye.
Terrific.
Thank you.